Hi, I'm Katie Stone. Welcome to Dystopia. This is the third in a series of videos designed to open new pathways into the genre for those unsure where to begin, or for the hardened dystopians out there, it's an opportunity to return to first principles, try and work out what drew you to dystopianism in the first place. These videos are designed to be watched in order, but I hope that you can dip in and out and watch them standalone if you need to. There'll be more resources, ways to get involved and information on my website at katiemcgregorstone.co.uk. But for now, wherever you are on your journey with dystopianism, and however much time and energy you have to dedicate to this today, you're welcome. My first two videos focused on genre, on the question of what is a dystopia and why is it useful to group texts together and talk about them as a genre. But something I left out of that discussion was the relationship between dystopia and utopia. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. How do these two forms of writing and thinking and creating interact with one another? To do that, I'm going to be focusing on Octavia E. Butler's 1993 novel, Parable of the Sower. This was a successful novel at the time, and in 2020 it was on the New York Times bestseller list, so I'm sure for many people you'll have some familiarity with this. However, just to give you a quick recap, this novel is set in a near-future California. It follows the story of Lauren Oya Olamina, a young woman growing up in the gated community of Robledo, what had been a cul-de-sac in a suburban town outside LA, has become a kind of fortress, high walls, topped with barbed wire and a fortified gate. The people who live in there only go out when they have to. They no longer regularly leave for school or to go to church, and if they must, to work or to get those supplies they cannot grow for themselves, they leave armed and together. This is because the streets have become far more dangerous. Climate change has led to droughts across California, and there's significant water shortage. There is a housing crisis, so many people are living on the streets. And increasing privatization means that there is no social security left at all. For example, if you want a fire engine to come to put out a fire, you have to pay them. So it's in this dystopian world that Lauren is growing up and living, and the novel tracks her life within this community and beyond it, always struggling against the world that she finds herself in. So I am going to discuss the whole of this novel, which does include spoilers, so if you don't want that, it's not for you. I won't be talking about the sequel, Parable of the Talents, if that's of a concern. And just at this point, I wanted to offer the kind of content note that Parable of the Sower itself does contain a lot of violence, including sexual violence. I won't be talking about that today, but I will be talking about some of the deaths that occur in the novel, including the death of a child, so I won't linger, but just to make you aware of that. I am talking about Butler's novel, Parable of the Sower, but in order to illustrate it, I'm also drawing on Damian, Duffy and John Jennings' graphic novel adaptation of Parable of the Sower, which is an adaptation, so it's not all of Butler's words, but I think it very much keeps true to the spirit of her text and offers some really striking images to accompany it. So just to give a quick recap of what I discussed in the first pair of videos that I've produced on genre, what I was asking there was, what is a dystopia? And to talk about that, I started with this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, which reads, a dystopia is an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible, opposed to utopia. Now, I had some problems with this definition, so this is my adapted version. A dystopia is an imaginary place or condition which is bad in a way which is not hellish, natural, traditional, or chaotic, opposed to utopia. So I try to differentiate out the specific badness of dystopia from other bad places. What I didn't talk about were these final three words, which are opposed to utopia. Unsurprisingly, I have a problem with these two, and this is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. I'm going to be talking about, firstly, the ways in which dystopia is opposed to utopia, how it acts as a critique of utopia. Then I'm going to move on to say it's more complicated than that, that dystopias are not just anti-utopias, that they offer something different. And finally, I'm going to argue that, in fact, the two are inextricably linked, and that, in fact, we might read a novel like Parable of the Sower as producing a utopia within dystopia, suggesting that the two are really closely connected. So to begin, we must ask, what is a utopia? And the simplest version of that is to say that a utopia is the good place to dystopia's bad place. It is an imaginary place which is considered to be better rather than worse than the society we find ourselves living in currently, right? And of course, it's more complicated than that, but I think that is really what utopianism offers. And I will put my cards on the table. I do consider myself to be a utopian. I think that utopianism is a really important and essential way of engaging with the world, of thinking not only how we can critique the society which we find ourselves in, but also how we can change it, how we can work to imagine a better place, and insist that it isn't inevitable to live like this. I think that in that way, utopia and dystopia are united. They're seeking to critique the world we live in, imagine more possibilities, more moments of potential revolution or transformation. But as a utopian, I think it's important to critique utopianism and be aware of its limitations and the ways it has been used to further colonialist and fascistic agendas. Conservative and reactionary utopias are everywhere. And so I think one of the things that dystopianism does really well is to critique some of those utopias, to show us that the offer of a dream of a better world is one that we should be really sceptical about, even as we insist that it is necessary to think that the world could be better. So I'm going to go through some of the ways in which Parable of the Sower does this, critiques particular kinds of utopianism and shows us its limitations. To start, I think that dystopias offer us a critique of utopias which are authoritarian. Now, in Parable of the Sower, this is most pronounced in Butler's depiction of the town of Olivar. So we see here the small coastal city of Olivar, just another beach bedroom suburb of Los Angeles, once well-to-do. High taxes and rising sea levels have taken a toll. So this is not the community which Lauren lives in, but this is a nearby city, formerly wealthy, but now in rather dire straits. See here from Olivar Councilman Noah Cannon, we're getting hit from all sides, an influx of salt water from the ocean and swarms of refugees from Los Angeles. Our residents are hard-working, tax-paying Americans, but just getting to work and back is like running some terrible gauntlet. Something needs to change. So we see here that clearly this councilman believes himself to be living in a dystopian scenario, and he believes in the need for change, right? We might be a bit skeptical of him. We see this dehumanizing language that he's using towards refugees, distinguishing people who, in fact, in this instance, are also Americans. Not that that should determine their humanity, but from the hard-working, tax-paying American citizens, right, of his town. He doesn't see these refugees as also people with needs, people who live in a world which must change. So we can be skeptical of him, but clearly he is responding to dystopianism, and as Lauren says here, something new is beginning, or something old and nasty is reviving, and this new or possibly old nasty thing comes in the form of multinational conglomerate Kajimoto Stam Frampton and Company, or KSF, who approached the city with a bold new vision for corporate civic collaboration. What KSF propose is that they will buy Oliver. They will buy the town, and then everyone who lives there will then work directly for them. Now this is critiqued within Butler's novel. Here we see this voiced by protester Emmett Clay, who says, "Room and board and salaries too low to live on. It's an old company town trick, debt slavery." Okay, so he views this intervention as itself a dystopian one, right? The KSF are coming in and they're promising a dream of a better world. They're promising change, security, freedom from chaos. But what they offer is being paid in a way that your expenses will always exceed your income, where you have no possibility of leaving, of moving on, where you are then trapped into a system of endless debt and the need to work off that debt. This is a bad utopia, an authoritarian utopia, which is being offered as a top-down solution from above. The promise is only order, and all you have to do to get it is to sell your freedom. But Oliver is not the only bad utopia that we see in Parable of the Sower. In Lauren's own community, we see some of what I would call nostalgic utopianism, which dystopianism also works to critique. So the novel opens with Lauren recounting a recurring dream that she has. And one part of that dream is a memory of a conversation she has with her stepmother Corey, while they are both outside under the stars folding laundry. "We couldn't see so many stars when I was little," my stepmother says to me. "Why couldn't you see the stars?" I ask her. "City lights," she says. "Lights, progress, growth. All those things we're too hot and too poor to bother with any more." "There are city lights now," I say to her. "They don't hide the stars." She shakes her head. "There aren't anywhere near as many as there were. Kids today have no idea what a blaze of light cities used to be, and not that long ago." "I'd rather have the stars," I say. "The stars are free," she shrugs. "I'd rather have the city lights back myself. The sooner the better, but we can afford the stars." So we see here Corey voicing this very understandable desire for things to return to how they used to be when her life was better, when she was much safer, much better off. However, even if she understands this longing, I think both Butler and Lauren are very sceptical about the idea that going back to a time where what was valued was lights and progress and growth would get us anywhere other than here again, right? The nostalgic time that is looked back on as a golden era for Corey, that she wants to return to, is in fact a direct cause of the dystopia that we see around us. I think Lauren uses the past as something that we can draw upon, we can scavenge and excavate to find useful things to bring into the future, but we cannot long to return to that past. Dystopias critique nostalgic utopias. Dystopias also critique bordered utopias. I've mentioned before the wall around the community, and I think this is a really important motif in Parable of the Sower, that the utopia that's imagined by Lauren's parents, promised in Oliver, all of these potential solutions have walls around them. Butler was very well informed about the politics of the US-Mexican border. She knew a lot about how debt slavery was, and in fact is, happening there, where particularly poor, black, and people of colour are being subjected to forms of debt slavery, right? To working conditions that they couldn't possibly hope to make more than what would sustain them, getting into increasing amounts of debt and then having to work on that debt. That is happening, and the violence of the border is really alive here in her depiction of this gated community, even as the people in the gated community are black people and people of colour, right? But the logic of the border remains, even as the wall is used to protect those people who are currently so oppressed by the border. One way which we see this happen in Parable of the Sower is through the figure of Amy Dunn. Amy is a little girl who is very neglected by her family. She lives within the community, but she does not receive any care there. She is allowed to wander free without any real kind of interest in where she's going, and this often gets her into difficult situations, as we can see here. So already her life shows that just being inside the walls doesn't mean that you're safe, that you're going to be okay. And Butler really hammers this point home during the scene where we see Amy's death. So Lauren writes, Amy Dunn is dead. Someone shot her right through the gate. It had to be accidental. The shooter either fired at someone standing in front of the gate, or at the gate itself, at the neighbourhood, at our supposed wealth and privilege. So here we can see that not only does the border not save Amy, not protect her from the danger outside, but it actually causes her death. Lauren speculates that maybe is that they were shooting at the gate, the people outside, and she says supposed wealth and privilege, but in comparison to the people living outside the gate, they really are wealthy and privileged, even if they are struggling within their walls. What this leads Lauren to reflect upon is the fact that her home is somewhere that she hates. She says, God, I hate this place. I mean, I love it. It's home, but I hate it. It's like an island surrounded by sharks, except our land sharks are on their way in. It's just a matter of how long it takes them to get hungry enough. And Butler very much has this vision that Lauren has come true. Lauren is right about what's happening to her community, what is going to happen. The wall comes down. Everything was chaos. They must have stolen that ancient truck just to crash it through the gates. So in a violent attack, the community walls fall, and Lauren manages to escape but is separated from her family, all of whom are presumed dead. The next day she returns to the community, only to find people scavenging over the remains. She doesn't meet anyone that she knows there, and she just has to scavenge alongside them through her own belongings. Who were these people, these human maggots, she asks herself. Did the fire draw them? So Lauren is unable to see this initially as anything other than the hungry sharks coming into her island, right? She sees this as a failure of the border, but just largely because it's not strong enough, right? It doesn't work to keep it out. But she's still attached to this idea that there are people within the wall that deserve utopia, right? That deserve safety, and the people outside are dangerous people, are in fact dehumanized. They are sharks. They are maggots, right? But what Butler shows us in Lauren's growing knowledge of the outside world is that this is the logic of the border still operating in her mind, and it's another border that she needs to bring down to survive. Lauren says that the man with the child came over to scavenge beside me, and somehow, perhaps because of the child, because this stranger in his filthy rags was someone's father too, I didn't mind. The little boy watched the two of us, his small brown face expressionless. He did look a little like Gregory being her younger brother. So, in company with 5 strangers, I plundered my family's home. So I think what you can see here is that Butler shows us that the problem with the bordered utopia is not just that the borders won't keep you safe, that the wall is always going to come down, is that it relies on a separation between the safe people inside, the real people, the deserving people, and the dangerous people outside. And we see here as Lauren is forced to mix with those people who are now not maggots or sharks but strangers with her brother's face. this distinction is a false one. So dystopias are critiques of utopianism. That is something that they offer. But they're not just anti-utopian. It's not as straightforward as that. And my thinking on this has been really influenced by Tom Moylan, and in particular his book Scraps of the Untainted Sky, Science Fiction, Utopia, Dystopia, which came out in 2000. And in this book, Moylan puts forward his vision of his understanding of what science fiction, what utopia, what dystopia is, his definition of them. And he also gives a really useful history of utopian and dystopian studies, showing all the figures that he's indebted to, including Darko Suvin, Frederick Jameson, Peter Fitting, Raffaella Bacalini, and Lyman Tower Sargent. I'm just going to be focusing on Moylan's word here today, and I'll be doing another video doing a deeper dive into Scraps of the Untainted Sky and into Moylan's analysis of Parable of the Sower. But to introduce you to his work briefly here, Moylan is very interested in critiquing utopianism, or a certain kind of utopianism. He writes, "A utopian gesture is of no use to anyone but the powers that be, if it does not recognise that its hopeful journey begins in refusing the bondage of the present. To slip out of the grip of the real world and merely posit some ideal alternative is to indulge in an abstract utopianism that lapses into nothing more than a debilitating distraction from present terrors, and a displacement of the concrete hope that humankind might do something to end them. Only by looking at what exists and exploring how crises can be segued into changes will the utopian imagination enter into its subversive and transformative work." So here he offers a critique, right, of what he calls abstract utopianism. Utopianism that doesn't engage with the present terrors, doesn't engage with crises as they are happening now. This is an advert for Dystopia, which is very engaged with those terrors and those crises. And indeed, he talks about how dystopianism does critique utopia. But he argues that, in fact, the dystopian manoeuvre, this manoeuvre of critique, of imagining a worse world, has in fact kept utopian hope alive by exposing the authoritarian state and the capitalist economy, but also by taking on the compromises and weaknesses found within utopian dreaming and actual opposition, refusing the temptation to move quickly to a restful refuge in one's own garden, by the riverside trees, or in some solipsistic cul-de-sac, and to forget the need for collective action. Okay, so he's saying that dystopia is critiquing that kind of utopia, the utopia of the cul-de-sac that we've been talking about, but also that it does so in order to keep utopian hope alive. He says dystopias are not anti-utopian, but now something else entirely. As dystopias, they are not texts that temperamentally refuse the possibility of radical social transformation. Rather, they look quizzically, sceptically, critically, not only at the present society, but also at the means needed to transform it. In dystopian texts, the society portrayed in an anti-utopian mode is obviously worse than what the author or readers know. However, the depiction works not to undermine utopia, but rather to make room for its reconsideration and refunctioning in even the worst of times. So he's arguing here that dystopias are critiquing utopianism in order to make it stronger, right? In order to make it ready to face the worst of times. His is a dystopianism that comes through utopia and retains that orientation towards a utopian horizon. So, drawing on Moylan's work, I've adapted this definition yet again. What I argue is dystopia is an imaginary place or condition which is bad in a way which is not hellish, natural, traditional, or chaotic, opposed to authoritarian, nostalgic, bordered utopias, while still being oriented toward a utopian horizon. So it's critiquing a certain kind of utopianism, while still being committed to that idea that the world can be transformed. Another world is possible. Even in the worst of times, there is hope. And I think that that's what we see in Parable of the Sower. We see utopia in dystopia. Because when the walls come down on Lauren's community, and it seems like this novel is just a critique of that kind of cul-de-sac utopianism, the novel doesn't end. We follow Lauren pick up her life again, bring together the few survivors from her community, and start on a journey where she collects more and more people around her to form a community that would actually be able to care for one another and to respond to the crises in which they're living in. And the tools which Lauren uses to do that are based on what she calls Earthseed, which is a religion of her own creation, or she says it has come to her, right? She has realized this truth about the world, which is that everything is oriented around change. So it's her critique of that which is static, people who would try to hold on to things as they are, and instead she's interested in transformation. The first verse of Earthseed, she writes it, is, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." So the God of Earthseed is not an authoritarian leader like KSF coming in with a plan where you just have to obey and then you'll be able to live a better life. This God doesn't offer you a nostalgic golden age, a pre-fall Eden to return to. And it doesn't say you are the chosen people and everyone else is to be forgotten. This God doesn't love you and isn't caring for you. It's not a person. It's just the principle of change, that everything is changing. And what Lauren argues is that if we accept that, we can ourselves then shape change, shape God. And Earthseed is oriented around that truth. Which I think is a utopian one. So I'm going to end now on some words from Adrienne Maree Brown in her book Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds. This is very influenced by Butler's work. She takes the idea of shaping change from Butler. Brown is a big reader of Butler's work. And someone who applies that directly to activism, to movement work. She's very involved in the movement for Black Lives, movements for disability justice, for prison abolition, queer and feminist organising, as well as eco-organising. And I'm just ending on her words, which I think, although she doesn't use the language of utopianism, really speak to dystopianism's function, not only as a critique of the society we live in, but of the ways in which we try and change it. Needing to critique those revolutionary moments, even as we hold on to the dream that they offer, that the world could be better. I think this really chimes with Parable of the Sower. We have lived through a good half-century of individualistic, linear organising, led by charismatic individuals or budget-building institutions, which intend to reform or revolutionise society, but falls back into modelling the oppressive tendencies against which we claim to be pushing. Some of those tendencies are seeking to assert one right way or one right strategy. Many align with the capitalistic belief that constant growth and critical mass is the only way to create change, even if they don't use that language. There are new strategies emerging or being remembered. Many would describe this as a shift from a masculine to feminine or patriarchal to feminist leadership. I see that, and I think it is also about something beyond all of our binaries, evolving in relationship with our hierarchical tendency. If love were the central practice of a new generation of organisers and spiritual leaders, it would have a massive impact on what we considered organising. If the goal was to increase the love, rather than winning or dominating a constant opponent, I think we could actually imagine liberation from constant oppression. We would suddenly be seeing everything we do, everyone we meet, not through the tactical eyes of war, but through eyes of love. We would see that there's no such thing as a blank canvas, an empty land, or a new idea, but everywhere there is complex, ancient, fertile ground full of potential. So, those are my thoughts on dystopia and utopia. There'll be another pair to this video on Tom Moylan's Scraps of the Untainted Sky, and more information and resources on my website at katiemcgregorstone.co.uk. The next video will be on the topic of space, not outer space, but space in terms of architecture, cities, urban planning, the spaces that we live in, and how they are imagined and controlled within dystopias, and the text I'm going to be using to talk about that will be Yevgeny Zanyatin's We. But for now, thank you, and you're welcome.